Uh, my brother, um, let me just go back to the tweet you sent me, where you were commenting about the elections in Nigeria, and you had said something to the effect that you were more depressed than impressed about the whole scenario. That we still need substantive intellectual movements to develop in Nigeria, and for politicians to embrace them and offer the people a vision. What exactly did you mean by that, brother? Could you add some more detail, add some more flesh to that skeleton?
Yeah, I think it's so important the way ideas feature in man's development, man's understanding of his nature, and how he can calibrate himself. He can sense his past, his present, and the future.
Hmm.
And I think that is what is missing in Nigerian politics and probably the wider politics of Africa. What I mean by that is it's not enough to just adapt the mechanisms and the verbiages associated with what the colonizers have implanted in African societies. It's very important for people to develop uh, themselves as a people from within and relying on their resources, the ability to deconstruct their own psyche in order to make progress. So, in other words, what I mean is that it's not enough just to get an education, stand on a soapbox, if that's what they do in Nigeria, and engage in sloganeering and even say positive things like, I want us to have a minimum wage, I believe in workers' rights, etc., etc. I'm thinking about underpinnings that people need more than to be card carrying members of a body that has a name, fanciful or not, but instead, what passes as political thought and the mechanism of politics needs in Nigeria an identifiable intellectual foundation. You need an ideological underpinning, and that underpinning, that ideology needs to be capable of being transmitted to the masses so that people have an idea, the average man has an idea where he fits into his society and as well as where his country fits into the larger world. Um, I don't believe we have that. And I think in a previous uh, message in correspondence with you, I sort of gave examples from the Arab world and Japan. You know, that for instance, um, in the Arab world, you had Baathism as a political movement, a secular political movement, which obviously became rather perverted under the authoritarian regimes of Saddam Hussein and, in Iraq and Bashar, the al-Assad family in Syria. But nonetheless, Baathism was an intellectual movement, which, yes, was created by Western educated people, but people with a strong sense of what their traditions were and where they felt the Arab people as a whole should be headed in the world. And I mentioned that as well as the militarist movements in pre-World War Japan, the Kodoha and the Toisei movements. And by saying this, I'm not saying that Africa and Nigeria hasn't had thinkers. I think Obafemi Awolowo was a deep thinker, as was Zeke, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, and of course Kwame Nkrumah with regard to Pan-Africanism. And we've also had the Negritude movement with people like Seda Senghor and other people from the Black Atlantic. But I think what is missing is something underlying, something fundamental. And it's something that can be difficult to explain because it may be in terms, it may be couched in some instances in abstract terms. But obviously, the end result is that we abide by the first maxim, I think, of human existence, which is man, know thyself. Um, and I don't know, you can add your observations to that.
Thank you very much, my dear brother, for that very clear exposition. Um, I was listening very attentively to you and to what you were saying, and in my own mind, I kind of paraphrased what you were saying to mean that you were saying that Nigerians don't have situational awareness. They have no real awareness of their situation. That seems to me to be the purport of what you were saying. When you were talking about the lack of an ideological basis to anything in Nigeria, the politics in Nigeria, social development, as you pointed out, we lack a basic guiding ideology. And I heard what you just said about Zeke and Awo and how they were champions of nationalism, African nationalism. With respect, my dear brother, I would disagree. I think, yes, the Arabs did very well with their Baathism, and that basically formed a platform for Arab nationalism. And I think everyone knows how far Arab nationalism has taken the Arabs. It took them quite far. Iraq was a very developed country before the 2003 invasion, as was Syria before the Western instigated war 7 years ago. So the point I'm making, or what I think, well, my own conclusion, uh, is that our primary problem, the fundamental problem, to use a very important word that you just used, is a lack of awareness. We are too ignorant of our true condition. I think that Nigerians, the intellectuals as well as the man on the street, have no awareness of the fact that Nigeria isn't an independent sovereign country, has never been an independent sovereign country. Nigeria has always, in my view, has always been a colony. It was established as a colony and it has remained a colony all through its lifespan, all ever since it was created in 1901. I think this is a fundamental problem until we understand that that is a problem. I mean, we won't be able to solve it. You cannot solve a problem you don't know or you haven't identified. You were speaking earlier, my brother, about knowing your place in your society and your country's place in the world. And it seemed to me, my brother, that as you were saying that, you were almost paraphrasing Malcolm X, who once said that I think it was in a speech to black people where he said that he prayed that God would bless black people and everything that they did, and that he hoped that we would grow to understand the problem of the world and where we fit the world picture. Now, that awareness of the world's problems and where we fit into in that world picture is lacking, is missing from the psychology of the Nigerian intellectuals, much less from the minds of the man on the street, the ignorant man who doesn't know who's very ignorant. Yeah, so that's my own view of the situation of the fundamental problem confronting us as a people. Um, you are a geopolitical analyst, my brother, and you analyze situations in other countries, in more developed countries like Russia. Uh, I've seen some articles you've written about Russia, I think you've also written about some other European country. I don't remember which one now. But the point is, you are dealing with more advanced countries. Now, when you turn the spotlight of your experience, when you turn the spotlight of your intellect, my brother, based on your experience of analyzing other parts of the world, apart from this lack of an ideological basis for national development, have you identified any other problems that you think uh, should be a national priority that we needed to be grappling with?
Well, I mean, if you reduce things to what should be done, well, if we just push back a little bit before I answer that to your response
Sure.
in regard to our level of awareness,
Hmm.
um, I think, yes, we need to be nuanced in terms of kind of developing or defining that what that kind of awareness is.
Hmm.
The average person knows that the African mind is colonized and African institutions are neo-colonized, whether by previous colonial powers or by international institutions which have been set up to perform that task, whether it's the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, or even agencies of the United Nations. So, and even on a just on a on a mundane level, I think the fact that people are aware and they do appear to react in disgust, in angst, when they hear of a particular Nigerian politician or wealthy people who go over to Europe or North America for medical treatment or send their children to school in those countries, or those who follow football can note that Nigeria, like the rest of Africa has such a tremendous potential in terms of developing football, but yet people are fixated on what is going on in the European Champions League.
Mhm.
Something which, they can, those of us who grew up as children in the 1970s, all the rivals we had in Nigerian football, where we thought the Green Eagles, as they were then known as, were heading to, the amount of people who went into stadiums, that is
Yeah.
not existent today. So I think they do have a conception about this, and they might bellyache, but unfortunately, nobody appears to have set a kind of a blueprint that enables people as a whole to sort of galvanize them in a way and to reform their thinking to obviate that. So that's that point as a comeback to your response to my introduction. But back to what you've just said about what are the problems facing Nigeria. I mean, I think it's just fairly obvious. It's obviously the issue to do with the economy and the ability of government and individual initiative to create the conditions whereby we can fulfill the potential, the human potential, as well as the material potential and resources with which Nigeria is blessed on both accounts. Secondly, obviously, is the security situation with this insurgency by Boko Haram,
Mhm.
uh, and there are also the secessionist movements in the Niger Delta area and among those from the Igbo ethnic group. And of course, we have to mention that battle between pastoralists uh, and
And herdsmen.
cattle, the cattle rearers.
Yes, the Fulani herdsmen.
That's right. The farmer pastoralist conflicts. I think those four are obviously the biggest problems that are faced. And I guess the problem here is that, going back to what we were saying about understanding the African psyche, uh, a means by which intellectuals can find a link between those achievements, those developments that were made in Nigeria up to medieval times by kingdoms such as Benin, Oyo, the Hausa Fulani states, making a link between that and modernity, and to bring the African man and mind of the African into the 21st century. That is very crucial, because I could use my book knowledge of what I know about how to combat counterinsurgencies, you know, counterinsurgency cultures that have been developed, say, in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia. But how does one stop Boko Haram? I have not seen anybody from the intellectual class, from the Nigerian military, who seems to have taken ownership or control of how this insurgency can be sorted out. You know, it's obviously something that can't be sorted out by brute force. You can't look and say, this is how the British operated in Northern Ireland, or this is how the Russians operated in Chechnya, and say you want to apply that to Nigeria. Because the end result is just a mess. We are merely, as has been the case, just appropriating, what has been sort of dispensed from other parts of the world, and purporting to apply it to our own individual circumstances. This is not acceptable, and so, to say it in simple terms, I just think that we need originality in terms of how we meet these threats, the threats of consolidating democracy, of combating Islamist terrorism, of trying to solve issues to do with discontentment and marginalization from certain regions of this country, and also this matter of solving the farmer pastoralist conflict.
Brother, my my appraisal of what you just said is that it coincides with the main campaign points on which the main points on which Buhari based his campaign, his recent presidential campaign, i.e., the economy, security, and fighting corruption. I think the problem of the Fulani herdsmen, the pastoralists versus the cattle rearers that you mentioned, can be subsumed on the rubric of security, as can the Boko Haram problem. If I may just share a few of my views with you in terms of Boko Haram. You mentioned the Russians and how they dealt with the insurgency in Chechnya, and you also mentioned the British and how they dealt with the insurgency in Northern Ireland. But the difference between those situations and our situation is, in regards to those two countries, Ireland and Russia, we're talking about capable countries that have some kind of effective intelligence service to detect terrorists, to detect those who are funding them, who are training them, where they're based, those who are supplying them with arms. Those countries have those capabilities. Nigeria doesn't have this capability in terms of identifying the people who are behind Boko Haram, funding Boko Haram, providing them with training, providing them with military intelligence, with which they can then launch attacks on the UN or the Nigerian military. The point I'm making, my brother, and this is a point that has been widely disseminated, is that Nigeria cannot cope with the Boko Haram phenomenon for the simple reason that those behind Boko Haram are more powerful than the Nigerian state. Obviously, we have state actors involved here. And if you also consider the fact that Boko Haram is an extraterritorial problem, this is a problem that is affecting the Cameroonians as well. The Cameroonians are contending with Boko Haram. That will go to show that this problem is beyond the scope of Nigeria in terms of managing the Boko Haram phenomenon.
Femi, if I can just briefly interject there.
Yes, sir.
Just to add to that, that's yes, you're correct about that extraterritoriality of it. There's obviously the Maghreb and the regions that are in West Africa that are closer, that are also involved there, some of which was exacerbated by the American intervention in Libya. That's true. That's true. But yeah, I thought I would just add that.
And I am very grateful, my dear brother. And the reason I'm grateful for your intervention is because you mentioned America just now, and there have been a lot of commentators and observers of Nigeria, of Nigerian society and Nigerian politics, who have advanced the view that Boko Haram is a CIA operation that is designed to destabilize Nigeria, gain access to the oil resources in the Niger Delta, as well as all newly discovered oil resources in the Lake Chad Basin, and that all this Boko Haram phenomenon started after the inauguration of AFRICOM, the African Command of the U.S. Army, in 2007. The first terrorist attacks that happened in Nigeria took place after 2007. And as I say, there are a lot of people who suggest, with some evidence to back up their suggestion, that Boko Haram is a Western intelligence operation designed to destabilize Nigeria and justify the intervention of the US military in that part of Africa. A key point that some commentators have made is the fact that the locus, what do you call it now, the centerpiece, the capital of Islam Boko Haram terrorism in Nigeria is in Maiduguri in Borno State, which is a border area. Now, that border region aborts Cameroon, Niger, and which other country now? I think there are 3 separate countries around that Borno area that adjoin the Nigeria.
Yeah,
and
that's Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon.
That's the one. Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. You're absolutely correct, my dear brother. Absolutely correct. Now, those 3 countries, my dear brother, as you know, are French colonies. Now, it is absolutely impossible, I repeat, absolutely impossible for Boko Haram to be operating, running guns and arms and training bases in that part of Nigeria without the knowledge of the French. Absolutely impossible. Given the location of Borno State, it's obvious, it should be obvious to anyone who's paying attention that the French are heavily involved in Boko Haram by virtue of the fact that how do you describe a place, the hotbed, if you like, of terrorism is in an area that adjoins French territories. And you and I know, my dear brother, that all these French, so-called Francophone countries are French colonies. They have always been French colonies. They were created as French colonies. They have remained French colonies. since so-called independence in the 1960s. All of these territories are controlled by the French. And I think that actually feeds into this popular view, a view that has been expressed by very knowledgeable commentators, that there is an ongoing scramble for Africa right now, a modern 21st century scramble for Africa, where imperialist powers, particularly the US, France, and the UK, are deliberately destabilizing parts of Africa in order to gain more control, in order to achieve a greater sense of control over these countries. And of course, Nigeria being the largest market, uh, you would have, as one would expect, a lot of attention is focused on Nigeria. Speaking of markets rather, you mentioned the economy earlier. Brother, I have often thought that we Nigerians don't have what can properly be described as an economy. I think it will be more accurate to describe what is called the Nigerian economy as the Nigerian market. An economy presupposes a manufacturing industry, a manufacturing base. We have no such thing in Nigeria. Nigeria is a nation of consumers. We consume everything, right down to the fuel in our cars, which is imported, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the cars we drive. All of these things are imported. So uh, I was wondering, do you have any comments to make in terms of your how you see this question of a Nigerian economy?
Yes, I'll gladly do so. But again, I'd like to push back a little to what you mentioned about Boko Haram,
Yes, sir.
because I have actually I wrote an essay about that particular issue back in 2013.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if you've read that. Did I ever send you that link?
I
It's
think you I think you might have actually.
It's
I think you
entitled
might have.
Nigeria, Candidate for Political Destabilization and Regime Change.
Hmm.
So, I have heard from even Cameroonian media reports about the suspicious activities of the French military. And of course, when you look at these sorts of issues and people say, oh, America is behind this, the CIA, you know what the immediate response is. It's to pathologize such a view and to call it a conspiracy
Conspiracy theory.
theory.
Absolutely.
But of course, we know that there have been so much in terms of Western machinations as far as Africa is concerned. France, for instance, was not pleased with the way Sekou Toure wanted to manage the post-independence situation. Unlike other leaders like Seda Senghor in Senegal and um, Houphouët-Boigny in Ivory Coast, uh, Sekou Toure wanted to pursue a more independent course, and for doing that, the French made sure they did as much as they could to wreck his economy before they withdrew. But in that article, yes, I did, or the essay I wrote on Nigeria and possible American and Western intervention, in terms of facilitating this insurgency, I have certainly examined that possibility. I think for all the grief we give Nigeria as a country, we must give credit where credit is due, and I think one one issue which may lend credence to American intervention, and I did write about the creation of AFRICOM in October. Coincidentally, October 1st, 2008. That was when AFRICOM was established. The date of Nigerian independence, and but Nigeria did perform, I think, a quite creditable peacekeeping role. In terms of policing the West African region, and effecting a peace settlement in the Liberian Civil War of the 1990s. And the CIA actually commissioned reports by the Brookings Institute, and they have another institute known as the Africa American Institute, which actually reported that, look, the success of these peace missions in Liberia threatened to eclipse both Britain and France, the former colonial powers, in terms of West African influence. So it's obvious that given the responses, first by George Bush, he created something called the Africa Crisis Response Initiative, that was intended to serve as a counterweight to the Nigerian-led ECOMOG. And so this idea of um, divide and conquer, keeping Nigeria in an effectively a retarded position, fits in well in terms of this covert supporting of an insurgency. We've seen this time and time again, and so that does not surprise me in the slightest. But I have examined that, and I think there is some logic and there is some evidence to back that up in terms of CIA and particularly French intervention. Also, before I answer your question again on the economics of Nigeria, just to mention the fact that having outlined the security problem posed by Boko Haram, I think, yes, the divisions within Nigeria, religiously, ethnically also, have had these implications in terms of how the intelligence services and the military can act in a cohesive fashion. I think it's similar somewhat to the Pakistani intelligence service, some of who are hand in glove with Islamic radicals, and others who are perhaps of a more secular bent and who are more Western orientated or under the control of the CIA. But in the same way, Nigeria, apart from the ethnic divisions, which can lead to, frankly, incompetence and a malnourishment in terms of the growth of vital institutions of the state for its benefit. The disease of corruption is something that we have to admit covers all parts of the society. And one of the difficulties of the Nigerian army, because I believe there are some brave and well-meaning people who have joined that army and are fighting and are dying on the front lines, is because of the incompetent leadership, which has meant that funds which are supposed to go towards the purchase of materiel have been diverted. I mean, it's incredible. It's absolutely astounding. It's disgusting that that should happen. But I would put it to you before we leave that this point by saying, well, let's think about practicalities. Anybody who accumulates knowledge from all parts of the world, understands human nature, will look at that problem in Boko Haram and think to themselves, we have an insurgency here. If we have, as the, in terms of the best background, we have a unified army, a unified and competent intelligence service, and purposeful political class, an administrative setup, in the civil service to back it up, then what Nigeria should have at the moment is a counterinsurgency strategy. Some of these strategies may be messy because they may involve duplicitous methods of infiltrating Boko Haram, and of eliminating members of Boko Haram in a manner which will strike people as being extrajudicial. But for some people, both in democracies or authoritarian regimes who've combated insurgencies, that may be part of the solution. But also, what I'm saying is that just overall, I have not seen any Nigerian military officer, and I have read a few academic papers. I haven't seen a Nigerian military officer or interested academic who has provided a kind of a blueprint template as to how one should combat the Boko Haram insurgency. But I can tell you that such a plan should be composed and developed on different fronts. There should be an economic angle. One of the things that's fueling this Boko Haram crisis is economic deprivation and marginalization. So the Nigerian state needs to be doing things to bolster the economy, to prevent people being used as cannon fodder for these heretical. I'm not a scholar in Islam, but I believe these people are heretical, backward thinking, medieval barbarians. You want to win over the dispossessed, the disillusioned youth by trying to provide economic initiatives for their betterment and for the betterment of that sub-region of Nigeria. So you need something that is geographical. You need an element of the counterinsurgency, which is based on propaganda. And the use of propaganda, some of it may sound negative, but it's also about positive things and highlighting whatever successes the Nigerian state can muster out of that situation. So the way you handle the media and the way you trumpet successes in, for instance, economic initiatives and foiling Boko Haram should be part and parcel of this counterinsurgency doctrine. I could go on, but those are two examples I will give you because it's interesting. You mentioned, yes, Borno State, and it got me thinking about the mentality of people, mentality of the African. Much to my shock, apparently history was removed from the syllabus in Nigeria.
Excellent point. Excellent point.
And when you mentioned Borno, I remember, reading and learning, studying history, my favorite subject. We learned obviously about the kingdoms of ancient Ghana, which is further inland than modern present day Ghana, which appropriated that name. Ghana, which metamorphosed into Mali, and then that was transformed into Songhai. We knew about the Hausa city-states, the Oyo, the Benin Empire. All of these things. And in the northeast of what is modern day Nigeria, around that Lake Chad basin, was this empire of Kanem Borno. I think their most famous leader was Idris Aluma.
Luma, that's
Go on.
And,
when you look back at that and look at what Boko Haram is offering, they're not offering anything to you. They're just offering you an Arabized, I'm afraid, sterile, backward-looking vision. Whereas if you think about what Idris Aluma and other leaders of Kanem Borno achieved, and then think about that, and then this is where the link comes in, that people living in the modern world in Borno State and other parts of Nigeria can then think about, well, what can we extract from that glorious era into the modern world? Lake Chad is a dying basin area, but think about other parts of the world where you've had regions that are composed of swamp, or where like in Holland, the sea was eaten into the soil. and the Dutch have reclaimed quite a lot of land, you know. And why cannot the same be applied among those people who live in the Borno area? You know, it's so shocking that people cannot have this sort of positive outlook to life. This outlook that is about developing the mental and the material resources of your environment. And even when you are beset by disadvantages, not an abundance of gold in the ground, or oil in the ground, that you can nonetheless overcome these um, these topographical and these geographical disadvantages. After all, in Libya, before it was destroyed by Western action, in concert with the Islamists, who are their claimed enemies, to overthrow the secular regime of Colonel Gaddafi, um, Gaddafi had that great river project, which is about um, uh, getting the water to permeate desertified land. Why is that not within the consciousness of people? You would not have this tragedy, this distraction, if the mindset of people, the common man, the intellectual classes, were attuned to studying and planning on how to combat the disadvantages of the landscape. You think about your past, you think about your present, and you look around the world and borrow ideas and put it together in your unique manner to suit your circumstances. So I just thought I would add that, and you can come back on that before I answer your other question if you feel like doing.
Um, yes, brother. Thank you. I think I will. And I would like to make, yes, it is a very lofty ideal to expect that the African will look back on his glorious past and try to recreate that in the present. But the difference between then and now, between the time of Idris Aluma and the situation we're dealing with in Nigeria today, is the fact that Idris Aluma wasn't a captive. Nigerians are captives as of today. Nigerians are Western captives. We've been captives for the last, what, 500 years? Ever since Nigeria was created as a captive territory, and it has remained a captive territory up until now. Even now, as I'm speaking to you, up until this very moment. So, in a situation where people are captive, where all their political institutions and leaders have been co-opted, where the common man is more concerned with getting a meal to eat on a daily basis than he is about the future of the country. It's not very I don't think it's very realistic under these circumstances to expect the Nigerian to be anything other than what he is, a docile, passive, long-suffering human being. Slave, I'm sorry. I think that's just the best description, the best definition of a Nigerian today. The Nigerian today, in my opinion, is the closest thing to a 21st century slave. You talk about um, the Nigerian political class developing an ideology, or the media uh, propagating the successes of the military in combating Boko Haram. But the point I would like to make to our listeners, my dear brother, is the fact that all institutions in Nigeria have been co-opted, all of them, whether it's academia, the media, the military, the politicians, everybody. And that is a function of poverty. Now, in a situation where the whole country is poor and everyone is grasping for whatever they can get or for their next meal, I don't think it's very realistic to expect such people to be designing blueprints for national development? Obviously not. And that is why corruption is such a cancer in Nigerian society. It's a function of poverty. And again, on the subject of corruption, I would like to just share with you, my dear brother, and our listeners, that main purveyors of corruption in Africa and in Nigeria in particular are Western countries, Western organizations. I mean, we've had a series of scandals in Nigeria. All of them, all the major scandals featuring the corruption of Nigerian state officials have involved Western companies, whether we're talking about Siemens or Julius Berger or Halliburton, or the list is endless. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work that one out. If you consider the fact that Nigeria is a country that doesn't produce anything, and as such is a consumer nation, so all our revenues are derived from oil. If we don't produce anything, of course the people are going to be poor, because all the jobs that would have gone into manufacturing all the things we need are here in Europe and in Asia and in America. So we have a situation where the Nigerian doesn't have the prospect of a manufacturing job until the day he dies. He will never he will never be employed in a factory. He will never be employed in anything remotely industrial or the production of goods on an industrial basis. No. Now, in a situation where everybody is poor, of course corruption will be an issue. Of course the institutions of the state will not work properly. And that is the primary point about the situation in Nigeria today. Nothing is working properly. The whole society is totally dysfunctional. Nothing, I repeat, is working in Nigeria. We have a country that is, you mentioned the civil service earlier, the army, the judiciary, the media, all of these institutions are comatose. They are corrupt and dysfunctional, all of them, without exception. There is no sphere, no area of Nigerian life which isn't corrupted. And as I say, that is a function of poverty and the condition of the country. My dear brother used a very interesting term earlier in describing Nigeria, that we have been locked in a state of arrested retardation, I think was what you were suggesting, that we have been locked into a place where we are eternally retarded and where our progress, our development has been arrested and has been held in check. And this is the reality. And that has been a reality from day one. Nigeria was created in 1901. From 1901 up until today, a period of what, 118 years. I will go so far as to say that we've only had 20 or so months of genuine independence. Back in the 70s that you mentioned that era, when Murtala Mohammed came to power, he only ruled for 6 months. And then the first intervention by Buhari, the first time he came on stage in 1984, he ruled for 14 months, I think it was. And that was the only time, the only period in our history where we have had genuine independent leaders who run Nigeria as a sovereign nation as opposed to a colony, which is how Nigeria has been perceived and how it has been portrayed by every other leader since independence. So the point I'm trying to make, my dear brother, is, again, I think that actually feeds into the question I asked you about the economy. In a situation where we don't have an economy, what hope is there for progress? How can you ever hope to develop or to introduce poverty ameliorating schemes or projects in a place like Borno, for instance, if the country is economically comatose, if the country is economically dead? As I say, Nigerians don't produce anything. the only source of revenue in Nigeria today is what we earn from oil, which is a natural resource. That's not something we have manufactured or made it happen. No, it was there in the soil. And we don't even have the equipment, the technical know-how, or the knowledge to get this all out of the ground. We have to rely on external parties, the Western oil companies, Shell in this case, and they're raping us blind. So under those circumstances, will it not be correct to, or will it not be more accurate to describe Nigeria as something very similar to a slave plantation back in America 200 years or so ago, insofar as we have a body of black people whose only function, whose only economic function is to consume, never to produce. So we're talking about a captive audience right there. Captives. Economic captives.
Well, I think this is where people, the assessment you give, I think it's obviously very sobering. It's very, some people might see it as being negative, although it is based on absolute realism. I think the question is, you need inspired and creative leadership. The question is, can Nigeria supply the sort of people who can break this spell and bring, as Zeke once put it, to paraphrase Zeke, to lead the black man out of the bondage of the ages. There are one or two things I want to say about the economy randomly before proceeding. I mean, the first thing is for us to recognize that Nigeria, being an oil producer, in some ways is reflecting what has occurred in a number of other countries that are dependent on oil. You have situations whereby majority populations, to one degree or another, um, ruthlessly acquire that wealth at the expense of the people who live in areas that produce quantities of this oil. But also the country as a whole has this, these oil producing countries have this, they develop this oil dependency syndrome and seem to lack the means of diversifying their economies. So in that regard, Nigeria is not that different. It's not offering excuses, but you have to put all these things on the table to be balanced and to have as wide a view as possible before you can successfully suggest and implement improvements or courses for development. I would say yes, I agree. Nigeria is a consumer nation. I think that was developed in the 1970s, after the oil boom, the oil boom years with Gowon, Gowon, who somewhat unwisely stated the problem with Nigeria is not how to spend
Yes.
it. And
Yes.
Gowon did do his best, I mean, some of it might have been wasteful and misguided, but for instance, I'm aware through family connections because I come partly from the island state of Grenada in the Caribbean, and the prime minister, a guy called Eric Gary, um, he mentioned to a relative of mine who worked there that at one time Gowon was paying for all the salaries of the Grenadian um, civil service, because they were going through some economic difficulties. So I think apart from the Murtala government and also the Buhari Idiabong duo, there were attempts at instituting positive things in Nigeria, but that this dependency took root in the 1970s as a result of the oil boom, and I think part of this matter of creating a consumer dependent society, and one that is not creating and out of the raw materials that are in that country and the vast human potential that is going to waste through unemployment and lack of employment opportunities and the overall corruption. We have to be balanced about it. Obviously, part of this is caused by Western institutions who effectively profit from enslaving parts of the world economically. But also, we have to look at ourselves and say, well, we can arise from this. But it's about the way it's about the way we approach the development of our human resources and capabilities. People will often, I think, mention the development of South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore. You may come back and say, well, particularly like in South Korea and in Singapore, you had a kind of a racially cohesive and culturally cohesive group, whereas that could at least participate they had the good conditions for developing their national economies, whereas the strife inherent in a multi-ethnic artificial state put together by imperial draftsmen, it takes quite a lot to overcome that, and people really should think about, although I don't agree with the methods that are used by the various pro-secessionist movements in the southeastern part of Nigeria, but people need to think carefully about how Nigeria can continue if parts of Nigeria are culturally divorced from the other, whether it's between Muslim and Christian, secular and religious. That will not be the be all and end all, because my argument is that even if you sort of created an independent oil-rich delta states, if you go into that having the mentality, which frankly is generally the same among other Nigerians, that state is doomed to fail. Like Equatorial Guinea, with all the wealth that it has, but it's been mismanaged by a family of corrupt profiteers and rather gruesome rulers. So yes, that consumer dependency culture needs to be overcome. And again, this is where it comes to developing the mind. This is where you need the creation of movements that create a foundation. No one is saying that the ordinary man is the one who will be at the vanguard of this sort of thing. This is where the leadership, it must come from the top, from those who are intellectually capable of providing such leadership and then creating the conditions for raising up the levels of the mass of people. And I think one other point that should also be made, apart from working on developing the mind, this is very important, not just the artificial importation of colonial institutions, or copying it of institutions from other parts of the world, is the form of governance that Nigeria may need. Is there a case for a kind of a benevolent rulership? It may sound anti-democratic, but within a benevolent dictatorship, there can be democracy. It's just that we are presuming, we are presupposing that such leadership would not be based on naked violence or threats of violence, or of the sort of the unimaginative leadership that means that, like a Sani Abacha, you loot the resources of your country. No, it's a creative kind of a leadership, which I think people, some countries in Europe were were lucky, were fortunate to have, which brought them um, into the modern world. So the structure of Nigeria, and as well as the means of by which it is governed by competent and well-meaning and purposeful and resourceful people, should be a priority. And this is where the political scientists, the historians, need to go to work. So far, they have not done that. Um, the other point I would also say is that part of this idea about deconstructing the psyche of the Nigerian, of the Black African, is, as I said, going back to that point about man, know thyself. It may sound abstract on a particular level, but it really is the beginning of all. And it's either that or a sense of decrepitude, a sense of um, stagnation and enslavement, which you've mentioned. That is going to be the prevailing pattern, unless people, these ideas can be brought to the fore and can then be implemented through people who can infiltrate the state and get a hold of the levers of power. I would also like to add the aspect not just of intellectuals, but also of culture. Um, we've had many capable writers, novelists in Nigeria, but I don't think any of them, whether it's Ngugi wa Thiong'u or Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, they've been good at criticizing, they've been good at describing the past and the clashes between the past and the present. But I don't think any of them have successfully deconstructed the mind of the Nigerian or the ethnic groups that compose Nigeria in the way, say, writers in Russia like Dostoevsky or Goethe in Germany have done. I think that is a very, very, very important thing because, deconstructing your national character, your strengths, your weaknesses, it's a very, very, very important thing that artists can do and which can permeate into other levels of society for the benefit of that society. I mean, I'll give you an example of Germany. Um, Goethe, the famous German playwright, philosopher, he lived at a time when Europe was coming out of the idea of the rightness of the divine right of kings. The French Revolution had happened, and Napoleon, before he became consumed with the grandeur, he was somebody with a vision. He was Republican, he was progressive thinking, and artists like Beethoven and Goethe were very, very comprehending of Napoleon. Now, with Goethe, the way he understood it was that, this is where you can draw analogies with whoever you want to draw among the names I mentioned about Nigerian artists, whether they're writers, whether they're sculptors, and obviously musicians, of which I'm sure you would give credit to Fela
Obviously,
Adebayo.
obviously,
Yeah, but you see,
obviously.
what Goethe did was that when the French Empire was being defeated in Russia and Napoleon was on the retreat, there was a surge of German nationalism. You know, Germany had been composed of all these different principalities, and then this surge of nationalism arose when they had the opportunity to dispose of the occupying French. But Goethe, this is the thing about moral courage, farsightedness, and the ability to deconstruct the psyche of your people. Goethe was very worried about this because he felt that nationalist Germany could not handle what they wanted. He felt nationalism would destroy Germany. He basically based this not just on his on his observations of the German mentality. I mean, he thought about Germany and its geographical location, you know, that it was an inland uh, territory, and it had no sea borders. To the north was a calm Baltic Sea. He felt that if these people succumbed to militarism, that was the natural counterpart of nationalism, that it would lead to disaster. And of course he was proved right, because you had the rise of Prussia, you had the rise of the Third Reich under Hitler, and Germany was involved in two world wars which brought national catastrophe. Uh, what Goethe suggested at the time, to the extreme displeasure of his countrymen, who thought that he was unpatriotic. Why would you not want to overthrow the French? Well, he felt that basically that Germany, if you gave the German the gun and a nationalist creed, he would go haywire. He would want to conquer his neighbors by force of arms, and he would lead himself to disaster. What did Goethe suggest as the alternative? He said Germany should invest in the culture. And what he meant by the culture was that Germany could, yes, inspire the world and, in a sense, conquer the world through its talents in culture, like music, in commerce, going back to the Hanseatic League from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance era. These areas that the Germans could focus their talents on. I don't want to go into how Dostoevsky deconstructed the Russians, but if you see my point, anybody else listening to this sees my point. I haven't seen a Nigerian writer do something similar to effectively point out the strengths and the weaknesses of this psyche and how it can be used and developed in a productive, in a productive manner. It may be abstract. It's something I myself would need to research and really start from scratch by studying philosophies from Africa and around the world. Because if I keep saying this, but if nobody picks up that baton, I think anybody else with literacy skills can at least do their best to point the way to others who can develop on this. Because I think at the end of the day, reforming the mind, the mentality, the psyche is of absolute importance, is of preeminent importance. And it's not just a question of us doing well by legitimately acquiring academic qualifications, being successful in what we do, outside of Nigeria's borders, sometimes in Nigeria, without being burdened by being referred to as a corrupt person. I think that is the be all and end all of the solution to Nigeria's woes, a reformation of the mentality.
I think you've made a very solid point, and this I think you've just said it actually. uh, Number one, I'm going to go and think about this. I'm going to go and think about uh, this project, this task that you just said about Nigeria, well wishes of Nigeria, deconstructing the Nigerian psyche, analyzing the Nigerian psyche. With a view to determining the strengths and weaknesses so that we can make an effective change in those conditions in Nigeria. I think that's an excellent point. You know what, bro? I really need to go and think about this one, actually. Now that you've mentioned it, I know that, yes, with the possible exception of Fela, I don't think any contemporary Nigerian writer or intellectual has undertaken uh, such a project. And I think it's required um, where someone really needs to study the Nigerian psyche, and put stuff down, in black and white. Just write it, just describe it, outline it, define it, define the strengths and weaknesses of the Nigerian, as you say. Um, I would agree 100% with your judgment, with your assessment that our culture has a role to play, and I will go so far as to say that it has played a very uh, regressive role, a retrogressive role in our development. The most immediate example that comes to mind is this deference that young Nigerians expected to uh, pay to older Nigerians, where you cannot criticize an older person, no matter how stupid that older person might be, just because this person is older. That encourages a level of subservience in the thinking, in the minds of the youth, which is why I will argue we have remained stagnant. That's another of the reasons our culture has had a stagnating effect on us. Quite apart from all the other problems we're contending with, imperialism, number one, the lack of education, and then, of course, our culture. Bro, as I say, yeah, sorry, you were going to say.
Nothing at all. But I would say, look, there is a lot to draw from the past. I think one thing that people from other parts of the world, from the so-called Orient, certainly from the Western world, that are ignorant about Africa about is that Africa was this undeveloped place with people living in the dusty land or jungle terrain and with no distinct forms of governance. I mean, you would think that, wouldn't you, if you were brought up with watching movies to do with Tarzan in the jungle, or
Yes.
the very, very skewed views of Africa, looking just at poverty-stricken places. They cannot comprehend the Ashanti Kingdom or uh, the Benin Kingdom, the Oyo Empire, as being these sophisticated um, states with which ruled over expansive tracts of land that had institutions, from Oyo, the Prime Minister Basharo, the Oyo Missy, the Arami.
Yes.
There was a logos there, a sense of the universe. There was cosmology, and there was in the affairs of governance a constitutional setup. You know, there was a system of finance, of trading. You know, Yorubas formed towns, not, they weren't just in villages. So that past, without necessarily going on to these contentious issues of where the ancient Egyptians, black, or look to your back door, of your history, you know, of what you as a people accomplished. When the Portuguese came to West Africa, they came as co equals with the Kingdom of Benin. They were enchanted by the order of the society they found, the splendor of the Oba of Benin. Portugal and Benin exchanged ambassadors. You know, this is the pre-colonial era, the era before colonialism and imperialism. So I think, how is this transmitted? Well, it's not, you're not going to transmit this to your people if you don't teach history in school, first of all. And if so-called Nollywood is not doing, the business of exploring the past in an intelligent way and marketing that to not just Nigeria and other parts of Africa and other parts of the world, imagine how the view by a process of osmosis would change about the image of the African. Let's face it, there's quite a lot that can be done in terms of reattuning the African mind so that Africa, Nigeria can find its place in the post-colonial society. And it's something that should be fought on all fronts, culturally, etc. But we need to look at the weaknesses because a number of these kingdoms, yes, they were eventually defeated by Western armies. The Ashanti Empire, Benin was conquered. And this was done by supposedly enlightened European nations who were just doing that to dominate and to exploit. So that is just a fact. So nonetheless, things like language needs to be explored. I mean, I think you have to look at a language and you have to say to yourself that language, if it cannot incorporate philosophy and be scientificated, what purpose is it doing in the world? These kind of decisions need to be made. Because I recall this argument in America. Do you recall? I don't know, it was in the 1990s or something like that, whether Black American or African Americans should be
The bell curve.
in
The bell curve.
Sorry?
The bell curve. Where some guy.
No, not that. Oh, we can talk about that. But I'm saying the teaching. They said the teaching of African Americans that they should use the kind of what's the phrase used?
Ebonics.
Ebonics, that's right. And my argument was that look, Ebonics is just like a dialect, just like a person from ordinary origins in northern England can speak their dialect. They'll continue using it, but when they're in the workplace, etc., they will use something different. And so that was my argument that yes, Ebonics has its usages in terms of expressions of culture, artistry, but is it capable of? Can you write a book on physics using Ebonics? If you can, fine. But if not, let's not push this retrogressive issue of saying that, black kids can only be educated by using Ebonics in class. And maybe an analogy can be made with some African languages that can be holding us back, even though we've had these languages imposed on us, and also for better or for worse, the greater world, has to use English, to a lesser degree French and Spanish, not you know most languages of the world. So I think that's also an important factor that needs to be explored if we're going to develop ourselves. But I think, just to sum up, it's about people arising from the intellectual classes to try to erect new philosophies, develop upon negritude and Pan-Africanism, develop on that, and provide something, some ideological, some cultural basis for um, creating the conditions that Africa can now have its own renaissance and develop itself, and take its rightful place in the world, and basically uh, call in this history of being actually the willing dupes of colonizers.
The willing dupes of colonizers. Now that's a phrase, which I'm going to get you to explain at a later date, my dear brother.